Hi guys, and welcome back to Artalap, a podcast dedicated to conversations on visual culture with me, Kamaini. It's great to be back after the hiatus, and I'm looking forward to bringing to you more interesting conversations. On today's episode, we have with us Natasha Ginwala, co-artistic director with Defne Ayas of the 13th Gwangju Biennale, which just wrapped up last weekend on the 9th of May 2021. For those who may not know, a biennale is a global, periodic, usually mounted every 2 years, as the term suggests, exhibition of contemporary art that is usually deeply embedded in the historical context of its location. I'm sure the Gwangju Biennale in South Korea is one of the most important such events in the international and definitely Asian art calendar. Begun in 1995, the Biennale has a radical history. It is the cultural incarnation, if you like, of the South Korean pro-democracy movement's triumphant culmination, beginning with the Gwangju Uprising of 1980. This uprising, commemorated on the 18th of May, so we are coming up on its 41st anniversary as we release this episode, was the beginning of a sustained struggle by all sections and strata of Korean society, from workers to students to the professional class, against the military dictatorship of Park Chung-hee that lasted through the 1980s and ultimately led to the establishment of true democracy in South Korea. Those interested in further reading might want to refer to the sociologist Ji Wook-shin. In 1995, 2 years after the second democratic election post the military rule, the Gwangju Biennale was founded and has since become a symbol of cosmopolitan contemporaneity and local artistic responsibility. The late great curator Okwei Enwezor, who curated the 7th edition in 2008, wrote a great essay on the Gwangju experience in which he discusses the way in which its historic and civic mandate infuses the Biennale spectacle, which, as we know, is inextricable from international capital, with a sort of revolutionary fervor. The Gwangju Biennale's 13 editions have been put together by artistic directors and curators from within South Korea and all around the world, including from India, Ranjit Hoskote and Nancy Adajania. Coming back to the Gwangju Biennale's latest edition, about which Natasha will speak to us, it was originally scheduled for 2020, but the COVID-19 pandemic caused it to be pushed to March-May 2021. Featuring artworks from around the world, as is expected of a biennale, that explored a series of ideas in depth and diversity. It wrapped up just this past weekend on the 9th of May. It continues to have an online presence and a guidebook for those interested in experiencing it. You can go to gwangjubiennale.org, and of course there is an archive of its presence on social media platforms. Apart from the exhibition itself, other aspects of the Biennale that Natasha and I refer to in this conversation are the public program called Rising to the Surface, its sort of editorial program called Minds Rising, which is a journal, and it's an online journal, and a feminism reader titled Stronger Than Bone. Themed Minds Rising, Spirits Tuning, the 13th Gwangju Biennale's conceptual framework has drawn on philosophies of intelligence, technology, and indigenous feminism. Two of the philosophers who steered the course of this edition informed the artistic vision that drove it and whose ideas we discuss in depth on this episode are Catherine Malabou and Yuk Hui. This episode might be a bit dense, but also rewarding. So I'll quickly give you a bit of a lowdown so that it's easier to access the discussion. Drawing on the disciplines of cognitive science, philosophy of mind, and neurology, Catherine Malabou develops a theory of the human brain as a site of work, agency, and liberation. Her broad argument is that capitalism yields an understanding of neuronal functioning as something over which humans have no control, and that our understanding of the human brain's suppleness is ideologically constructed as flexibility in order for capital to better exploit our brains. She counters this understanding by positing that, in fact, the human brain is defined by plasticity and not flexibility, which means that we have control over what happens to it. And that our consciousness regarding what we can have our brain do, our capacity to make our own brain, can emancipate us from capitalism's demands. Coming to Yuk Hui's work, we talk about his concept of Cosmotechnics, which he defines to mean that a society's art making and craft making technologies are part of its moral and social imaginary. By emphasizing the cosmos in Cosmopolitan, in a word beleaguered by climate change and human havoc, Hui argues for a historicization of science and technology that takes into account the specific world making within societies and cultures rather than just the one largely Eurocentric theory of technology. Hui's notion of recursivity is also part of our discussion. Those of you familiar with computer science will know the term. In Hui's case, we are to comprehend it as an ontology or an account of reality. Recursivity as an account of reality. He says that phenomena are generated anew through protocols of repetition. So that's the intro course to this episode. You will all be required to submit 10-mark answers in the comments and win a prize. I'm kidding, there is no prize. But you're welcome to submit 10-mark answers and responses. More on the episode, we discuss how a biennale is mounted during a global quarantine, what the significance of organic, artificial or machinic intelligence is during an age of unreason, with regard to Malabou's idea of the brain as a site of emancipatory politics, and how the ghosts of history cause new ruptures through the phenomenon of recursivity that we just touched on. We also talk about the role of a biennale as a recorder of change and its paradoxical implication in the very orders that it aims to challenge. Before we dive in, let me introduce Natasha. She is Associate Curator at Gropius Bau, Berlin, and Artistic Director of Kaleidoscope Festival. She curated Contour Biennale 8, Polyphonic Worlds, Justice as Medium, and was part of the curatorial team of Documenta 14 in 2017. Other recent projects include Kaleidoscope Festival Sea Change in 2019, Arrival Incision, Indian Modernism as Peripatetic Itinerary in the framework of Hello World, revising a collection, at Hamburger Bahnhof Museum für Gegenwart Berlin in 2018, Riots, Slow Cancellation of the Future at IFA Gallery Berlin and Stuttgart 2018, My East is Your West at the 56th Venice Biennale 2015, and Corruption, Everybody Knows with Eflux New York in 2015. She was a member of the artistic team for the 8th Berlin Biennale for Contemporary Art in 2014 and has co-curated the Museum of Rhythm at Taipei Biennial in 2012 and at Museum Stucki, Lodz in 2016-2017. She is a recipient of the 2018 Visual Arts Research Grant from the Berlin Senate Department for Culture and Europe. Before we continue, I'd like to let our listeners know how to access the material accompanying our conversation. To view the images and other material being referenced and discussed in the episode, click on the link in the show notes to access the guide. You can also find the link to the guide for each episode in our Instagram captions and tweets. Thank you for joining us, Natasha. It's great to have you with us.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me to your podcast. And I think at this time, conversations have become a vital form for all of us in big and small ways.
Yes, indeed. Can you tell us a bit about the theme of the 13th Gwangju Biennale and unpack the broader concerns and ambitions of the event? Maybe talk about the theme itself, Minds Rising, Spirits Tuning, and take our listeners through your curatorial vision for the Biennale.
So what we set out to do within the 13th Gwangju Biennale, which is titled Minds Rising, Spirits Tuning, is to consider the spectrum of organic and inorganic intelligence and to think about ways that the forms of intelligence that are living and that are machinic are entirely entwined. And this is becoming more and more our dominant reality, right? So,
Yeah.
algorithmic regimes are governing our sense of time and our sense of everyday,
Hmm.
also the hierarchies of power. At the same time, there are ancestral, indigenous, environmental, matrilineal forms of intelligence that are equally shaping a common truth
Hmm.
and a common perspective of the world. We need to perhaps really hold these at times competing and paradoxical forms of intelligence in a circular way of thinking and a circular way of examining these with artists,
Hmm.
with thinkers. Now, that's what we were setting out to do because they are not operating separate from each other, as we know.
Yeah. Hmm.
And so we've been working with artists really also, not thinking about, obviously, medium specificity, because that already is quite a regressive notion, but rather how do artists apply forms of mobilizing various areas of the mind, the body mind as well, the mind as part of the living body that is in pain, the living body that is exploited, the living body that is oppressed. So these are all not only thematics in a sort of intellectual sense, but really they are at the core of our practice in this biennale. So I will, as we go forward, give you certain examples
Hmm.
of artistic projects.
Right, right. That will be very useful for my audience who can refer to the image guide to see what you're saying. I mean, I know this is probably one of the stock questions you've been asked because of the circumstances in which this Biennale was mounted. We know that it was delayed because of the coronavirus pandemic. Other Asian biennales have taken place as well, of course, during the pandemic year. How was it for you to organize this offline and online in quarantine? I can't imagine it was easy, and I know that you had to be coordinating with your co-curator, Defne Ayas. So tell us a little bit about that.
I think there is a lot at stake in terms of collective cultural production and collective cultural thought that resonates in a singular way, really, through what is a pandemic reality and its manifestations. So, firstly, I just want to preface with that factor of really the aspect that curators are meant to be, in a way, caretakers, and that, of course, is a word with that comes with a lot of responsibility and a lot of weight. And perhaps at this point, definitely curators are not at the front lines, and are not primary caregivers or caretakers, in that literal way that the term kind of holds you to that responsibility. The Guangzhou Biennale is one among other responsibilities that I have undertaken collectively over the last 2 years. So we were appointed, Defne Ayas and I, as artistic directors in March 2019. And so we've really had a full 2 years to
Mhm.
bring this project to audiences physically and also via digital channels. The fact was that we also knew that while the Korean context is extremely vibrant, there are museums and arts centers, public and private, being built there at a quite a high paced level and of a really astounding quality. However, it is also an extremely patriarchal and bureaucratic structure as a nation and as a biennial foundation to work within. So that is also part of enfolding itself as part of this reality of what is Asia's largest and most and oldest contemporary art biennale, to take that up at the time of pandemic, and also within this webwork of a patriarchal bureaucratic setup which has its own internal power codes. So really, as a director, one is not working only with artistic content, but also what it means to really deal with these temporalities, these sensibilities, and the infrastructure that it needs to endure through this time of 2 years. But also, since you were asking about what it means to manifest the Biennale during the timeline of pandemic, I just maybe mention a couple of things, because it is a fact that also within Asia there have been biennales that have been held. There is currently also the Shanghai Biennale going on. There has been the Yokohama Triennale curated by Rax. There has been also the Taipei Biennale co-curated with Bruno Latour and a team. So we are not the only ones. And in that sense, we are constantly learning and adapting with each other.
Yeah.
We are not able to attend each other's biennales. So that is another big transformation, because biennales have been a ground for rethinking, repurposing, tuning into different forms of practice and thinking. So the fact that we are now not able to even attend, there is then a difficulty with research, with making connections to various artists. So while it was a luxury also to be jet setting and visiting biennales, it also has been a form of study, a form of collectivity. We also had to think from our side of what are we offering really to those who cannot make it. And this is in fact something that we have been thinking also prior to the pandemic. And it helped that this is not, it's not going to work only as an emergency process. You know, while we are producing art at in an accelerated way at a time of great distress, there is also a need to already open up the models that have been long running and assess what is their validity today. How do they continue to be in a global engagement also beyond the art world coordinates?
What are some of the specific aspects of the programming that you designed, keeping in mind the changed circumstances from when you were appointed, or that you think happened to work to the Biennale's advantage in a sense, given the world's dramatic transformation?
With Gwangju, it has in fact been very much about having a civic mandate. It is a biennale that opened in the aftermath of trauma, in the aftermath of the Guangzhou Uprising. So it has a certain pivotal role to play in the local cultural ecology. And we are seeing that there is a cross generation of publics that we are very thankful to, that they are lining up to attend a biennale in these times. In parallel, we also have been thinking, as I mentioned, before the pandemic, or already when we proposed our ideas to the Biennale Foundation, to include editorial strategies at the core of the Biennale. So that's something I'm quite interested in, and so is Defne Ayas and our two editors, Jill Winder and Yongjun Tak. Some of us come from a journalism background, and so we've been thinking really of what an editorial process can be in tandem with artistic models. So it's not the typical making a catalog and writing, again, for a pure sort of art world engagement, but really working with various thinkers, various social thinkers, scientific thinkers, poets, historians, and artists, to create an entire publishing platform, which is online and also in print. So that effort for the Minds Rising journal actually began very early on in our process. Further to that, we also worked on a public program that is called Rising to the Surface, Practicing Solidarity Futures, that again took into account the fact that it was the 40th anniversary of the May 18 Gwangju Uprising in 2020, which again was bringing forward the spirit of democratization in South Korea, struggle against militarism. But at the same time, there were certain hierarchies at play. What are we forgetting when we commemorate certain kind of martyrdom? What are we forgetting and leaving out when we do not acknowledge the participation of students and women at the same level as we do of male protagonists or male identified protagonists? So we've also been thinking what is omitted in a history of struggle. And alongside that, we're using Gwangju as a prism to think about the current citizen movements and civic advocacy, work against environmental degradation and environmental violence with people from all over the world, which includes journalists, artists, filmmakers, activists. So there was this entire program, really with over 20 people participating, and that we had initially thought would happen in Guangzhou, but then it expanded and took place as an online forum. And in that, again, we were also thinking very much about digital labor and algorithmic asymmetries, algorithmic violence, which again is something we're looking at. It's rampant, right? We know what it means when news feeds and social media feeds are censored, almost to the level that it's equal. No, so the fact that a citizen can be seen as an antagonist to the state in the very same way that a reputed journalist can be seen. And the speed at which the state responds is also extremely quick and simultaneous. So we've been interested in all of those aspects, which are affecting many parts of the globe, not just India, and have been looking into this as well. So it's not a biennale that is operating in exclusion to these troubling realities, but very much thinking about an embedded approach and foregrounding that embedded approach while taking its own timeline, as a resource as much as a challenge.
Right. I think it's really interesting because you kind of given us like a very broad survey of the processes and infrastructural aspects of the Biennale, and the fact that it was an endeavor that has lasted for almost 2 years now. And that's interesting because it sort of began before the pandemic struck, and in some ways, it's marked the transition from the so-called before time to the current situation. What I feel is also interesting about what you said in the beginning about this etymological sort of link that curation has to caregiving, which has become such an important paradigm currently across discourses, as we know, and in actuality, I'm just thinking of that as a kind of feminist methodology as well, right? Care work. So I find that link as well kind of interesting to think through. Curation as a fundamentally feminist act, not in a reductive or essentialist sense, just in the sense of caregiving being something that we associate with progressive politics. So I think that struck me as interesting also because I was trying to work, imagine your own, your and Defne's, advancement through these 2 years of developing this, and then actually being in the middle of something that makes it so relevant, makes this approach, this methodology, this kind of vision so relevant, so opportune in a sense. There's a certain, this what you spoke about with regard to algorithmic violence. The pandemic has also created a situation in which the digital or the algorithmic as a form of intelligence in terms of the inorganic, non-human, or artificial mind or machinic intelligence has become a source of attention and care in a way that was obscured prior to this. We know that, I mean, there's a certain kind of economy of violence, and especially exploitative labor practices that is embedded in, this kind of flattening of life, to quote, right? Whether it's the example of gig economies or similar kinds of, precarious labor forms which operate through apps. But during the pandemic, you also find that the algorithm has become a way to connect, to call upon, say, aid, community resources, and support. Look at what's happening in India right now. It's entirely because of social media that the people of this country are being able to function. The government has abdicated responsibility. We are living in some kind of bizarre oxymoronic, state enabled anarchist dystopia. And this is obviously just citizens who are on the privileged side of the digital divide, who have access to social media technologies. So, and anarchism, as we know, has this kind of history of mutual aid, community support networks. So, do you want to talk a little bit about that and how, for instance, the Biennale happening at this time, mirroring all of these events that you could not have predicted at the time of conceptualizing it? How would you kind of, speak to this?
So, just to start with, I wanted to share that as part of the Biennale publishing program, we have in fact worked on a feminisms reader, which is called Stronger Than Bone. And it is published with Archive Books in Berlin, which is an independent feminist press, and the Gwangju Biennale Foundation as well. So, what we felt was that even in the kind of writing that is circulating as part of current feminist language and positions, there felt for us a certain lack, especially when bringing forth interdisciplinary and cross-generational positions that can also institute a way of being together, as cultural practitioners. There is often this sort of academic versus activist divide. And we felt that it was extremely important to present a set of positions that, for instance, include the Afro-Brazilian feminist leader and philosopher Djamila Ribeiro, with somebody like, for instance, Uti Piaski and Eva Christina Harlan, who are a Sami artist and archaeologist duo who have been working on matrilineal approaches to culture, ecology, archaeology, and their contribution of what has been obscured and oppressed by Nordic colonization, by the so-called welfare state, as is idealized coming from the Scandinavian context. So really cutting across geopolitical timelines and geopolitical hemispheres. And so there's that. And there's also, somebody like Maya Indira Ganesh, who's a technology scholar and researcher, who's been thinking about AI in the most incredible ways. Also really questioning what is AI and why is AI in the macro setup such a toxic hierarchical system in which there's still Silicon Valley effect that filters down to the most intimate levels of the feminine body or the non-binary body. So really kind of thinking about technology and flesh, or AI impacting, at that deep level, aspects of sexuality and sexual relations. Many, many things like this, So I really feel that it's not a naive kind of engagement with these very formative questions of our times. It's more about ways that for us, it feels that, there is a resource being generated and that resource has an afterlife. So that was our purpose. And of course, I agree that clearly it is these very platforms that are allowing us to reach out to one another. Also, given the deep failures and violence of state regimes. So, but humanity is constantly in the mode of adaptation, which has so far also been a lot about progress in a neoliberal sense. Now, as there is a virus that is mutating in a way that is faster and less predictable than, say, we have as the current generation of life on Earth witnessed. We are lost in our process of adaptation. And so that anarchic drive, that survival drive, is also a creative potential in order to rechannel and recalibrate ways to encounter each other, ways to protect each other. So I'm really trying to also assess, where is the creative potential in this? Not only the ethical dimension, which is of course crucial in all of this, but is there a creative potential in this? And I would say yes. Also, when we were asked by various press and partners, has the Biennale changed since the pandemic began? Has the theme changed? Have artworks changed? And we would say everything has changed. So clearly, it is not like, oh, let's give a new title to this. That means nothing. What we were thinking about is we're now immersed in a radically altered reality wherein artists, among other practitioners, are continuing to find purpose in their act of making. What we have provided is an invitation and is a structure in which there was constant dialogue. And in fact, in many ways, we felt that the projects that were already on their way to manifesting started to become more and more urgent, more and more complex in what they were seeking to realize. And in certain ways, also, the pandemic reality entered into the work. So in the case of one of the filmmakers, Korakrit Arunandonchai, his film Songs for Dying is very much also bringing together the protests in Thailand, the passing on of his grandfather, the enduring trauma in Jeju Island in Korea that suffered militarism and a massacre. What are the processes of remembering and commemorating? Bringing in stories from mythology, from ancestral narratives that allow that circuit of life and death to manifest in much more complex ways, in ways that truth of the time cycle is beyond the accelerated life cycle as we know it now. And in this time also, we were criticized for it from some parts because we were bringing in a lot of indigenous knowledge and practices on their own terms, bringing in Korean shamanic cultural artifacts, relics, documents, really bringing in popular visual culture, inseparable from the contemporary art on view, but intersecting with those vocabularies, intersecting with one another. And of course, there were a lot of questions, but we took on those questions from a space of wanting to engage deeper, because these are unresolved aspects to also our practice. And that is, in our belief, what a Biennale needs to do. It needs to also create a sort of dynamic momentum for unresolved questions and unresolved possibilities, and see what unfolds. So there is an element of intuition, of chance, and of risk in the exercise itself.
Very Badu of us. But yeah, I mean, I was also I sort of I'm hearing you talk about all of these possibilities and a certain kind of optimism as well. I'm reminded of that quote from Yuk Hui's lecture that was part of the Biennale's online programming. I think on incomputability and incalculability. He talks about recursivity, which is a concept that he's, as we know, worked on for a long time. And he said something really interesting. And it sort of, when you were talking about the life of the sort of the generative possibilities of the Biennale, I was reminded of that. He said that the world is a recursive algorithm, and each organism is a unique genetic expression of the same process. His claim is basically that it's a sort of counter to linear ideas of discrete repetition, and he's talking about this kind of this risk that you mentioned, or this contingency, this happenstance, this novelty being incorporated by the recursive logic of at least his account of the world, his metaphysics. And I thought that's it sort of also made me think of you and Defne. Both of you belong to contexts that are currently facing, or have been facing for many years now, extreme forms of authoritarianism. Turkey and India both. And authoritarianism that is rooted in recovering a mythical, made up past, invented past, whether that's the pre Islamic Hindu period, or in the case of India, or the pre Republic Ottoman period in the case of Turkey. Is sort of, and a perverse sort of looping is happening here as well. How do you kind of think of recursivity as something that is both, again, full of hope and optimism, as a condition that can rise to the occasion of the new, and at the same time there's this strange kind of regressive thrust that also seems to be part of it. And I'm asking this also in the context of the Biennale, and maybe you'll talk about specific works, because of the fact that it seems like the region as a whole is undergoing this, whether it's Myanmar, whether it's Thailand, as you mentioned, is experiencing or undergoing this recursive trauma almost. So do you want to just talk about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the context that we particularly come from are undergoing great turmoil, and the fact that this turmoil is also a circulation. It's not static. It's a condition of such extreme flux that it also shatters some of the predestined tentacles of oppression. It overturns those as well. So the question of how much suffering is to be endured and by whom, I think, is an essential one to pose, because one also comes from a place where there is a safe distance to an extent, and that distance, of course, can in a moment be done away with, and you can be at the front lines of vulnerability. But I still feel that as a curator, one is an organizer of perspectives, positions, ways of life, not only the exhibition. And so in that sense, recursivity, or that grand circulation that takes account of the unpredictability, the various interruptive feedback, but also the kind of dynamics of distance and proximity. That's the kind of recursivity that I think Yuk Hui talks about, because he's also thinking about technology as embedded with a worldview and views of the world to come that then takes us to culture. And that's why Cosmotechnics also relies on cultural being and cultural vocabularies, not only looking at technology as a singularity. And so within that are, again, algorithms, but also within that is climate change, within that is synthetic biology. Now, there's so many forces acting on and with the human. And so I'm not coming at this from a sense of pure optimism by any means, but simply trying to join many pursuits in observation, because I think in a sense, artists are incredible observers of their time. And that's also why they can shuttle between history and speculative futures, outpouring of perspectives that can be launched in a biennale is of some use today. If we felt that there was no use for what we were doing, we could have called it to a halt. We could have halfway, when the first postponement happened, we could have talked to the team and the artists and the city and found a negotiation to bring this to a pause. But in fact, at every stage, we felt that there was a need for it. And we were checking in with those who are involved, if they felt the same way. In a sense, for those who have been through this composite process, it's not closed. And that's something I'm also invested in trying to, bring forth, because all of us need to understand that we cannot work in the same ways that we used to. So also, what is it that remains in what we are able to achieve? I think those are, the bigger questions also of particularly cultural work. It's not about the medical equation. It's another equation of care.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I think a better word than optimism would just be maybe something like anticipatory, looking to the future. I think that what's also interesting to me in terms of the thematic concerns of the Biennale was this interest in intelligence and consciousness. And, we've been talking about it to some extent thus far, but what precisely drew you to the discourses of intelligence and consciousness, especially in this sense of in this kind of with this meaning of sensus communis? Why do you think this particular historical moment is amenable to being looked at through this kind of implication of the cognitive, the computational, the cosmic, and not to suggest that they're in silos or that they're not co-constitutive, because also that's a theme that keeps emerging in your curatorial interrogation and including in this interview. You spoke about affect, and I think that that's one of the things that's that sort of, I mean, this dynamic between the affective and the rational, I mean, very crudely put, is kind of so much at the heart of the rise of, let's say, illiberalism currently in the world, right? How do you appeal to intelligence and reason at a moment when they both seem to be divorced from the community making or the sort of life practices around the world? And I think also because you cite a philosopher like Catherine Malabou, who sort of is arguing for an emancipatory vision by locating that emancipation in the brain, in sort of in the neural processes of the human mind. So I find that's it's a kind of provocative challenge to take up.
The first drive towards working on the question of intelligence came also from thinking about the workings of Korean society, where there is a sort of techno-utopia and a fast-growing economy that is supported by AI visions and AI's seemingly elastic capacities. But at the same time, there is also a place for superstition, there's a deep history of missionary practices of religion, there is shamanism, there is spiritual cosmologies, the mountain river landscape that determines the life capacity of this island nation. And so we felt that to really harness these fields of intelligence in non-binary ways, to really understand the transactions between and the tensions between these forms of intelligence and of the communal mind, histories of consciousness that have been left out, histories of consciousness that have been written out. This again was obviously before the pandemic, but we did feel the need to address these facets, knowing that the Biennale is that common ground of inquiry in which we can make a start. So it's not about grand claims and a conclusion at all, but as accomplices and fellow companions, we obviously did consult people like Catherine Malabou or Maya Indira Ganesh or Yuk Hui, Matteo Pasquinelli, all coming from very different positions actually in their own work. So even there are contrasts to what each of them bring. And it is not therefore about one view on inorganic or machinic intelligence. It is in fact about views that also are kind of counter claims and counter productions for us. And we did pick up on Malabou's, what shall we do with our brain? Defne gave me that book really at the beginning of the writing our proposal. So when thinking about the extended mind, we were referring to her approach around neuroplasticity. Again, the fact that the brain is not a given. The brain is constantly rewriting its codes through various forms of experience and stimulus.
That's kind of recursive too.
Yeah. And yet, with the way that the labor cycle has radically shifted globally, what Malabou brings out in the interview that we did with her for the journal, in fact, is also, where is both the emancipatory, the anti-capitalist drive, but where also where are we going with this new threshold of digital labor, which is again something that also Vlad Enjolar and Kate Crawford have written about, and where again they're thinking not only of the human in this entire cycle, but in their anatomy of AI, it is not, in fact, it is really the anatomy of AI. So it includes all of the dimensions from extraction from the earth to companies like Amazon to the human user. And that is, in fact, what a full anatomy is for them. So I think there's these many different ways in which we have opened up the question, and we are somehow also receptors in the sense of really receiving and analyzing at the same time this kind of massive flow of information that has been coming to us from artists, from writers, as part of the process.
Yeah. And I think that, we've been talking about this anti-capitalist drive throughout this conversation in various ways, in various formulations. What really resonated with me about Malabou's thesis was when she talks about the slippage between flexibility and plasticity, contrasting flexibility as a state that merely takes form and plasticity as a state that both takes and imparts form. Right? I mean, we use the word flexible with regard to, let's say, a rubber band, but you use the word plastic to talk about the plastic arts, sculpture. An element of agency is implied, and flexibility is sort of the conceit of neoliberal ideology. You're constantly working, these casual jobs, contract labor, temporary work. And I mean, that's a very real material dimension to all of this abstraction that we must contend with as a kind of theoretical underpinning to the world we live in. But I think that the fact that she talked about capitalism envisioning our brains as sort of terminally pliable, according to the whims of capital, rather than capable of resisting this enframing and generating something by itself. eliding its plasticity or its ability to be active and not just be acted upon by capital. That struck me as sort of the crux of her thesis. But I also wanted to connect that to the art world, and this as an your culture worker yourself. The art world is sort of completely configured, by precarious models of labor, capital accrual, even a biennale, like superficially. Of course, you've talked about how it does have a life that exceeds the temporal limits, but superficially, let's say, it has this impermanence and built into it, and a role in the global circuits of capital. The art world itself is adjacent to luxury, the luxury industries, and the commodification of objects and labor. So it's also implicated, right, in this kind of network.
Yeah, I think you raised really important points in terms of what Malabou has been discussing and linking that back to cultural labor. I definitely feel and have been reading also more and more about this question of flexible labor, which has been so indispensable to our industry. And we don't even use the word industry often enough.
We don't, yeah.
It's like film industry or industry for heavy machinery, but the art world as an industry has slipped away from what it means to logically ground itself in certain rule making or in certain codes of membership. A lot of it is about affiliation. Those aspects also play into the demands for a continuous flexibility, for a continuous supply of newness, also in art making and art theory, less about a horizontal engagement across the many sectors of the arts community. So there is a centralization of what is trendy, what is in demand, who is in demand based on also where they are at in terms of their social profile. So these are all extremely important aspects to address from within the arts industry. So the part of flexible labor has been exploited massively, and in fact, as Malabou also is putting forward in her book, in really the first chapter, when one is conscious of the brain and conscious of the historicity of the brain, then there can also be a place for a radical emancipatory understanding of it. The endless flexibility is a myth, and it's a falsification of the mind's true nature or true role, at a biological and a social level. So if it comes to the point that flexibility is making us numb to the sensations, the predictions, the affective capacity, the capacity for complex thought, and then that's also what trauma does. And we need to ensure that this nexus between flexibility and trauma and the loss of that vibrant capacity of intelligence is not what we are succumbing to as cultural workers, sometimes without knowing it, or obviously also not out of our own choice. I really feel that for most of us, there's this way of really using so many different compartments of our brains simply because of the way in which our economies are divided. And those economies, it's really not the same for other professionals. But for us, it's a certain amount for writing what you love to write, a certain amount for doing the kind of smaller projects that truly nourish your brain and that are for your creative community and more sustainable perhaps in broader ways. And then also catering to another part of institutional domain of culture, whether it's a gallery or it's a patron or it's, a private museum, or if you're lucky, I don't know, a kind of public platform, depending on where you are in the world. So it's not that there are so many categorizations of one's field of action in other fields, in other professions, but the fields of action in our profession are so highly subdivided and at times even segregated. But on the surface, it's like, oh yeah, we're all allies and we are performing our labor in a communal sense. But the diversification of that labor is truly, truly intense, and it's spiraling outwards beyond our control. And so even this is something that, I think hasn't been written about enough. Also, when one thinks about curatorial practice or, kind of theorizing the role of the curator, this is very much left out in terms of, what is it that you're juggling and why?
Yeah, and I think that hearing culture professionals and culture workers talk about their work in terms of money, in terms of all of these acts and activities that constitute the work itself is really important, right? I mean, there's no transparency about any of this. And I think just to kind of go back to Malabou as well and what you're saying, I mean, it's true, right? Like, I also think, how do you think about trauma when you sort of counter this kind of capitalist neuronal ideology, as she calls it? How do you think of a post-traumatic mind? How do you think of a non-traumatized mind? I feel like if you look at this, the generations of people who are actually operating as workers right now, nobody is without trauma. So even to kind of have this paradigm of like the mind being a site of liberatory politics really makes you wonder, because you just can't imagine or envision that that a mind that is not traumatized, that is not in some way afflicted by neuronal capitalism. To paraphrase Mark Fisher, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. I mean, yeah, but I think art making for sure is a way of reflecting on that and also reorganizing all of these relationships, right? Political, social, and economic. Um, kind of go to move towards something sort of less dense. I thought I'd ask you a cliche question, but I think it's important to kind of understand the workings of a biennale. How did you select participants in this case? And since there were two of you, I mean, there are two different minds at work. So what were the criteria by which you conquered or resolved disagreements?
We worked in a very horizontal way, also driven by our own contextual research. It was not obviously divided in the sense that Defne would, only introduce artists who she has previously worked with. We're both very committed to really looking at the networks that we had yet to tap into, and the artists that we may have done studio visits with years before. So we're really looking at an expansive way of exchanging with each other from various periods of our practice. And so, for instance, I had the opportunity in 2016 to go to Haiti and other parts of the Caribbean on a residency. And that would obviously not be possible in 2020. And so I was really drawing from that experience and sharing, a few of the artists that I encountered there. And that's how the painter Gerard Fortuné, who's a practitioner also who drew actively on voodoo and Afro-Haitian ritual, but also bringing in these syncretic perspectives in relation to political life in Haiti in ironic ways. This happened to, come to the table. And then there's also several practitioners, especially in the field of performance and live art, who Defne has come to know, few she has worked with, but many who she has never worked with before were also introduced to us. And we really thought of new approaches to engaging them, and especially due to the pandemic. What does it mean to involve performance-based practices? And sometimes, in the case of Cecilia Bongolea, for instance, who worked very closely with Defne and Davide Quadrio, our producer, to engage a group of kids who were practicing Taekyon, which is a Korean martial arts technique. And she was instructing them from a distance because she couldn't travel. And they were integrated into a procession that was taking place live in physical form at the Biennale. So the Biennale became a kind of a set and a playground and a field of mobility through that action. In that same procession were also the duo ethos, Kudes and Dimitri, who have developed their performance and body techniques, really ethos standing for really operating system, as an operating system, it's a mind-body system that uses elasticity, confluence, flow, various body techniques, but also really thinking, very consciously mapping the kind of cognitive features of ourselves while in the act of movement and performance. Where does surrender, attack, and defense intersect? How do we map those? This was also something that was being done really on site at the Biennale. So we work with many artists also for the very first time. And that's always an interesting challenge and encounter with deep learning involved. So it wasn't like, kind of regressing into a space of comfort, but really also thinking, okay, who are the practitioners that we really want to bring forward and be in their company. So also it wasn't about dividing responsibility in a way that we compartmentalized the Biennale. We worked with 3 curators who were part of our team. Ju-won Park, who is based in Seoul, and she also works at the MMCA Museum. Cristina Honia and Michelangelo Corsaro are both based in Berlin, and were really key to also, throughout this challenging period, being really connected to the artist's kind of innate sense of how they wanted to deliver their projects. And also for us to then install without them on the ground, which is a first for all of us.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of what I was also interested in, because you're kind of doing this thing where you're operating across multiple time zones, geographies, and having to kind of coordinate virtual and actual processes and procedures, right? And I imagine that has its own kind of logistical challenges as well, because it's just, there's so much involved. So that I wanted to ask if there was any work that was particularly tough to kind of mount once, the pandemic hit. Like you were really excited about it, but then you realized that, oh, shit.
I think we also approached every quarter with a sense of awareness and, as far as we could, a sense of empathy toward one another, knowing that there is this highly demanding bureaucratic institution that we are all part of in Gwangju. So a lot of our work was, in fact, creating a kind of protection zone for the artists to really enable them to focus more on the dimension of their intuitive and research-based process. And at every quarter, we would be releasing parts of our online journal. We were having our public program going on from already October to February. So there was always a way to refresh and make the process more dense or more elastic, depending on our progress. And yeah, I mean, it was extremely demanding to install without the artists on site. And they were very generous and open, also coming with a sense of trust, because it's quite painful to have made an artistic work through this time, and any case a sense of everyday alienation, and then be separated from your work and from the audience that witnesses it. So that's also why one is so conscious of the affective networks and channels that are at play in this encounter. The physicality is there, and we worked with an incredible exhibition architect, Diogo Passarino, who really transformed the site in incredible ways, really also breaking a lot of the codes of the white cube and the black cube that reign supreme in the art world. Really breaking that down, thinking of transparency, of organic flows, of ways in which a sense of immersion and a sense of expansion can play a role, so that the physical dimension and the bodily experience of being in an exhibition is wholly felt and sensed. But of course, our international audiences cannot dwell in that, nor can most of the artists. But still, we really believe that this is an experimental mode also that breaks many established codes of the monumental art show.
Right. I was going to ask about that.
In itself is a lesson, and again, it's a chapter in hopefully other such trajectories.
Yeah, I mean, what you were describing about the artists sort of having to trust you at a level that they probably, hadn't maybe had the experience of before, because usually in such instances, people are on site and overseeing and, helping supervise the installations. And for you to also be sort of, I was thinking about the kind of, the history of the word again, like it has this kind of ecclesiastical origin, right? The curator. But yeah, I was also intrigued by the inclusion of the People's Archive of Rural India and the work titled The Grind Mill Songs features, and I'm truncating and quoting the curatorial text here directly, couplets or ovi sung by women in rural Maharashtra. This archive of texts, sounds, and videos was initiated by activists and scholars Hema Raikar and Guy Poitevin, who traveled collecting and transcribing over 1,000 OV in the 1980s and 1990s. Reading the description, I found myself a bit discomfited and wondering for whose gaze the work of these communities is at the Biennale for. I was a little unsure about it as well, because I haven't had the chance to see it in person, but it sort of to me seemed like it may run the risk of museumizing an indigenous form, and to kind of go back to the Cosmotechnics conversation, there's, to me, like, I'm always a little wary of this kind of essentialization or reduction to an object of indigenous or vernacular forms. And we know this also because we belong to societies where those ideas have been hijacked, in such bad faith and by dishonest actors. So I just wanted to kind of, get your take on that,
Sure.
like, that sort of critique.
Thank you for bringing up the People's Archive of Rural India and the Grind Mill Songs project. So for me, Pari has been seminal and path-breaking in what they are achieving at the level of people's journalism and rural reportage. And this is a decentralized effort as far as there can be, really, I believe, because I did study journalism under several people, including P. Sainath. And so I, have been in touch with him since he founded Pari. So it's not kind of coming out of the blue. And also in terms of the grindmill songs, like many, I was looking at it through the website and through listening to SoundCloud, and it's also a living archive in the sense that the women involved have been consistently also, sought out, and they are in, some of them are in touch with Namita Vaikar, who's managing editor of Pari. She's constantly also in the process of translation, of categorization of this huge resource. So the point is that it has been talked about, it has been written about, the process is ongoing. It's not some kind of closed off chapter of Indian history. And therefore, the point is how to integrate it meaningfully within a biennale. In fact, they were very open and very excited about that possibility. And we did pay a lot of attention to how to create an architecture, in this case, again, with Diogo Passarino, which is a space for close listening, for the kind of attention that this project needs. And so we've created a kind of a circular space with also seats that have these kind of high circular, like almost like a little amphitheater seating, within the Biennale hall. And the songs are chosen and categorized by Namita very carefully, thinking about seasons, caste, family, dramas and hierarchies, cultivation issues and ecological precarity. And there's explanatory text. So it's very much, in fact, interpreting the logic of this archive from the ground up. And in fact, this also is a potential model of how to share it with communities in an analog sense, and hopefully with communities across India, so that it's not only staying at the level of the auditory, but there is a spatialization. And of course, Sainath has taken his early, photographic works and created, you can call them exhibits, but they're basically, taking them to the villages, to the communities, in extremely innovative display techniques and extremely light in terms of what it takes to carry these, not with the burden of cultural infrastructure that we sometimes rely on. So I'm interested in that process. I think if we don't take these risks, then we are just staying with the kind of art that is well established, well-trodden ways of working. And I'm not interested in purely maintaining those lines and divisions.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's also a conversation worth having in relation to the discourse in India as well, from the mid-century onwards, with people like the relationship between the contemporary and the, and indigenous art forms, often sort of relegated to this category of folk. And even in critical writing and curatorial practice, we have people like K.G. Subramanian and onwards, that sort of tradition. So yes, you're right. It's important to kind of have these conversations, and in curatorial interventions to this effect as well. And on that note, thank you so much for joining us. I know that we won't be able to see, witness the Biennale in person, but I hope that it gives people a sense of what's possible with curatorial practice, especially at the scale and level of a Biennale, which is an important, node in the art world. So thank you again for talking to us.
Thanks so much. When I went to the Gwangju Biennale 10 years ago, I had no idea that I would be involved in curating it. And also at GNU, when we had Raks talking about Manifesta, or when people like Vidya Shivdas and Ruth Noack were talking about Documenta, one had no idea that there would be real engagement with these kind of platforms. But I hope so much that some of these realignments also take place in the way that they should, and sometimes by also having the vision to, in a sense, break out, and just take that one step in a direction that is intuitive and might feel pretty much out of the ordinary and scary. Sometimes that is what it takes. So yeah, thank you so much. I also wanted to mention that our Biennale guidebook is also available on the website for download. So there are specially written texts on all of the participants, as well as the journals. So these have been also our way of creating freely accessible resources to the publics who could not visit. And I would love to hear people's insights and inputs on some of these. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for tuning in to Artalap with Natasha Jinwala, in which we discuss the 13th Gwangju Biennale 2020 on the eve of the 41st anniversary of the Guangzhou Uprising that circumscribes it. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like and share the episode over social media. For more information and updates, you can follow us on Instagram at art.alap and on Twitter at RTALAAP. Before I go, I want to take a moment to send strength and support to our listeners as we in India battle the COVID-19 pandemic. I hope you and those you care about stay safe during this time. A reminder too that direct messages on Artalab's social media, Instagram and Twitter, are open if you want to share resources, especially if you're an arts and culture organization wanting to spread information about relief initiatives.